Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Stephen Margaret, work in the pre-sales team in EMEA, and it's my job to take you through the Migrating SAP to the Public Cloud Business Overview. So in the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be looking at what it takes to deploy SAP into the public cloud. We'll understand some of the OS decisions that need careful consideration as part of any SAP migration and transformation project. And we want to make you aware of some of the technology and processes that SUSE have in place to assist you on that journey. Now, this is a business overview, so if you're looking for those deep tips and tricks, you will find those in other SUSECON Digital sessions, and I'll point out where you might be able to find those. So let's start with this. This is an oversimplified SAP project chart. So anybody that's been involved in any SAP transformation project will know that there are probably a few hundred or so boxes missing from this chart. But the point I wanted to illustrate was the fact that in any transformation project, it's going to be complicated. And we often find that the OS itself isn't considered until it's too late. And when we deploy to the cloud, there are decisions that need to be made with regards to the OS, and it's important to make the right choices before you get too far in that project. So what exactly are you going to be building? Well, regardless of your hyperscaler choice, what we're essentially building out is a data center in the public cloud. And whilst the hyperscaler will take care of the hardware and the security of the data center right the way through to the virtualization layer, everything on top of that is going to be taken care of by you. And it's not just about managing the OS, but there's so much more that needs to be thought about during that process. So normally when I talk to our customers about their SAP deployments, I talk about these 6 areas and how SUSE can help. So let's start with deployment. So here's a brief overview of what's needed to deploy and configure a highly available SAP system in the public cloud. First of all, the CSP or the CSP team needs to at least build out some of the infrastructure, and then normally the OS team would take over and do some of the OS configuration, and then finally your SAP team would get involved and do their bit in order to make that service available to you. Now, the idea is when you move to the cloud, you can't often take these on-premise methodologies and take them with you into the cloud. We often need to think of a smarter way to deliver this when we get there. And one of those things is automation. Now, automate yourself out of a job is a phrase I first heard when I was speaking to a company about how they deployed their SAP into AWS. So essentially, the company embraced the cloud and its flexibility to make their lives easier. In fact, every process they created was accompanied by an automation layer which would enable them to do that again and again. Because the idea is, why go through a build process for a virtual machine or an instance when automation can deliver the same results following your best practices again and again and again with just a few clicks. It even helped with the day 2 management, for example, snoozing the VMs. All of this was automated, and that allowed their team to go on to the next thing rather than managing the current things that they needed to do. And the other benefit of automating those deployments is you no longer need to deploy so far ahead of time when things only take a few hours to deliver. But of course, there needs to be an investment of time when it comes to automation. Now, the general consensus is that it takes around 4 times the effort in order to automate a process than it does to just do it once. So if there is something that you only need to deliver once into the cloud, it obviously doesn't make any sense to automate that process. But as soon as you have something which needs to be repeatable, for example, delivering application servers, database servers, doing the configuration and so on, it absolutely makes sense to invest the time and effort in automation. Now, SUSE has an open source project which can deploy an SAP cluster on the main CSPs in under an hour. All right? And this is based on HashiCorp Terraform, which is well established as a tool to deploy the infrastructure into the CSP. And then alongside that, it uses SALT to configure the operating system and configure the server, deploy the SAP software, and configure a cluster and deliver something that's pretty much ready to go in the public cloud. Now, you'll also find that your chosen CSP has automation tooling as well, and it's worth noting that SUSE is supported with all of those, whether it's CloudFormation templates within AWS or some of the open projects that Microsoft has for deploying infrastructure and SAP solutions into the cloud there. So now you've thought about how to deploy, the next question is, what are you going to deploy? Now, of course, I'd like to think that SUSE is going to be the natural choice for SAP, but when it comes to deploying SLES in the cloud, there are a few things you need to consider. Now, there aren't many one-way doors with the cloud, but this is potentially one of them. So you need to make a choice. The first one you need to make is which version of SLES do you want to deploy? We have a standard SLES version, which is perfectly capable of running SAP solutions, but we also have something called SLES for SAP, or SUSE Linux Enterprise Server for SAP applications, which has additional features such as extended lifecycle, software to deliver HA capabilities, and a series of applications bundled with it, which benefit those customers running SAP workloads. Now, there's going to be other SUSECON Digital sessions which cover this in depth, so I won't go into the differences at this stage. The second choice you need to make is the consumption model that you're going to use in the public cloud. We have two main ones, which are pay-as-you-go, and that's where you pay for SUSE alongside the VM. The other one is bring your own subscription, where you can take your existing SUSE subscriptions or subscriptions which you purchase via a partner or from SUSE into the cloud. Now, it's not all or nothing. Okay, you can mix and match depending on your needs for the estate. But one key fact is this: once you've made your choice for a particular virtual machine and you instantiate that virtual machine inside the public cloud, there is no way to change that. Okay, it's one of those one-way doors where you are looking to sorry, hang on, sorry, Russ, gonna have to start that one again. The second choice you need to make is the consumption model that you need to build. And again, the second choice you need to make is the consumption model for the virtual machines in the public cloud. We have two main models. The first one's pay-as-you-go, which is where you pay for SUSE as part of the virtual machine cost. The second option you have is the bring your own subscription, where you can take your existing SUSE subscriptions, which you have, or perhaps those that you buy from a partner or directly from SUSE, and you can use those and take those into the cloud as needed. It's not all or nothing. You don't have to have the same model for every virtual machine you deploy. You can mix and match depending on the requirements. But let's unpack some of those talking points and look at the differences between the two. So the first difference between pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription is commercial. All right, with pay-as-you-go, as you can see by the chart, you pay the CSP for the infrastructure piece. You also pay the CSP for the SUSE subscription as well, and that entitles you to support and fixes and updates. The bring your own subscription route is subtly different. You obviously still pay the CSP for the infrastructure, but the SUSE piece are either existing subscriptions or subscriptions you buy from a partner. So there's three things to consider there. The first one is the number of vendors involved. If you want a really simple life, then pay-as-you-go makes the most sense because you're not having additional vendors for different components as part of this solution. The second one is VM snoozing. So if at any time you think you're going to be turning off these resources inside the public cloud, when you turn off a pay-as-you-go machine, not only do you stop paying for the compute costs, but you also stop paying for the SUSE piece as well. With a bring your own subscription, if you snooze that machine, you obviously save on the compute costs, but you're paying for that SUSE subscription as an annual investment. And therefore, you're still technically paying for that as time goes on. And the last one is estate coverage. All right, so you're responsible for having the right amount of subscriptions to cover that estate. With pay-as-you-go, it's very simple. When the machine is on, you have that entitlement and you're paying for that. When it's off, you no longer have that entitlement. Again, very simple. With bring your own subscription, you need to make sure that you have the right amount of subscriptions to cover the amount of workloads that you're deploying inside the public cloud. The second difference between pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription is around the support model. So with bring your own subscription, as you can see by the chart, SUSE handles all the Linux support for the instance. With pay-as-you-go, because you are technically a customer of the CSP, your route to support is via that cloud service provider. Now, of course, SUSE will back you up, but it comes down to how you want your support for SAP to work. Do you want to be able to speak to SUSE directly, or are you happy to use the CSP as that initial point of contact for all issues to do with the virtual machine and Linux? Out of the main differences between pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription, this is the one I worry about the least because SUSE and the CSPs try to provide a very joined up experience. We have SUSE support team members dedicated and working alongside all the CSPs. So whatever you decide, you might find your current processes which you're using for your on-premises SAP support may need slightly tweaking when you move out to the public cloud. And lastly, we have patching. So with pay-as-you-go, SUSE provide an update infrastructure within the region where you've deployed your SLES workload. So for every region where you can deploy SUSE Linux around the planet in all the main hyperscalers, SUSE provide a series of update infrastructures for allow you to connect to and get all the fixes and updates which you're paying for. Now, there's not a huge difference between this and bring your own subscription, because with bring your own subscription, you are entitled, of course, to connect to the SUSE Customer Center. And the difference is going to be speed and latency, right? If you are patching from a local repository, then it's going to be a lot faster for you than patching from the main SUSE mothership. Now, the chances are, if you're patching an SAP landscape, you're going to need something more than simple repositories. So whichever model you choose, whether it's pay-as-you-go or bring your own subscription, you need to think about deploying something a little more comprehensive to handle that patching anyway. And SUSE Manager can be used to manage both pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription workloads. So which is the right model? It can often come down to the workload itself. Certainly when thinking about workloads which will be powered off for a large amount of time, perhaps pay-as-you-go is the way to go, right? So if it should be turned off or it could be turned off, then absolutely pay-as-you-go makes the most sense. If the workload is going to be on for a large portion of the time, and that's normally we find production systems, production databases, sometimes pre-prod as well, then perhaps look at bring your own subscription or a pay-as-you-go reserved instance, which is where you're committing to the software and the infrastructure up front. Again, you can mix and match on your estate, so it doesn't really matter which way you want to go for each workload. So what about business continuity? So when we talk about continuity, we need to define what we mean by HA and DR. So for me, HA is all about keeping services as available as possible within a single region. And DR is how to recover everything when things have gone really, really wrong. But where SAP is involved, we normally see most focus for HA around the single points of failure, such as the database. Disaster recovery needs to define how to recover all aspects, so the database, applications, and infrastructure, etc. Now, all the CSPs already have well-defined capabilities to provide a lot of the infrastructure resilience that you're going to need for this SAP system, and they also have the expertise to tell you how to use it. So they absolutely need to be involved in any decisions and design around how to deliver resilience in the public cloud. But where SUSE can help is by providing not only the HA software, which allows for solutions like SAP HANA to automate, or we can automate the failover of SAP HANA between primary and secondary servers in the case of failure. But one of our value points is the fact that we offer the best practices on how to do that. So if you're looking to deploy a highly available SAP system in the public cloud, then you really need to take a look at our best practices. Now, if you want the solution to be reliable and supportable, then following these best practices is key, because it allows you to build on all the knowledge that SUSE has gained over the many years that we've been delivering this. Now, we have multiple HA scenarios which are documented for AWS and Azure for SAP HANA, but we also have best practices for the on-queue replication server and NetWeaver deployments as well. Now, one of the more recent best practices SUSE have published came after a request from one of the CSPs, and that is our multi-SID ASCS environment. Now, up until now, the best practice has been to have a single ASCS ERS cluster, just have one cluster to support that. Now, what we can do now is have up to 5 instances of the SAP in a single SUSE cluster, which means a lot less complexity, and it also saves a huge amount of money as well. Which of course leads us nicely onto cost reduction. So actually my son recently turned 13, so he's a fully fledged teenager, and he never cleans up after himself. He always leaves the lights on, and I figured out that that's very similar to how things are deployed in the public cloud. All right. So if you don't need a resource, switch it off, delete it, snooze it, whatever you need to do to stop paying for that. All right. So I've seen some projects where test VMs have been left on for months, or large blocks of storage which are used for a data migration have been left in place long after the migration was successfully completed. But aside from promoting good housekeeping, SUSE can help to reduce cost in a number of ways. So we talked very quickly about pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription, but SUSE also offer an annualized software subscription. And that's where you can reduce the cost of the SUSE components by committing to a year's worth of SUSE up front for a particular virtual machine. And that can save you roughly around 60% of the cost of Linux. So we normally see that in conjunction with a reserved instance, which is where you commit to the CSP for the infrastructure for a year up front as well. The second piece just refers back to automation. All right, it's all about provisioning just in time. So you don't need to build something 1 or 2 weeks in advance if the process is automated. All right. Now we talked about the engineering project that SUSE has to deliver SAP workloads in less than an hour. Now that project might not be 100% of what you need, but if it fits 80%, then there's nothing stopping you taking that project and just doing that last little bit or that final 20% to meet whatever your requirements are. And of course, whilst the final point on this slide is more of a CSP benefit or a benefit of moving to the public cloud, it's important to change the mentality around the size of VMs that you deploy. Right? So we no longer need to look at investing in hardware for the next 5 years. You don't have to worry about how much your system is going to grow, what it might look like in 5 years' time, because you can simply upgrade to faster, larger virtual machines with just a few clicks. So once these systems are deployed, it's important to know what is happening in your landscape, right? It's not just about whether services are up or down. It's about what events happen across that landscape. So I've had customers who experience cluster failovers and nobody's noticed, right? Because the cluster recovers the service so quickly, or it happens during the night. Everybody comes in, the system's working as normal. Whilst that's great, all right, because the service is up and running, that's not really ideal, all right? And that's why SUSE allows you to work with either the CSP's own monitoring service, where we can send out some events from the cluster and have those managed by the CSP's own monitoring framework, or perhaps another method that you might want to look at is another engineering project which SUSE is currently working on. And that's the ability to present dashboards using Prometheus and Grafana. And we've got one illustrated on the slide here. So they show the health of not only the operating system, but the HA cluster and the SAP solution as well, whether that's SAP NetWeaver or a HANA database. Now, again, there's other sessions in this event which talk about that solution in a lot of detail, but it's important to be aware that it exists as an option. So I've left security until last, but it should be mindful during all phases of the project. Now, security for SAP in the cloud with SUSE can be split up into 3 areas, okay? The first one is using the CSP's capability, all right? And by that, I mean, we're talking about using data encryption, network isolation, any feature which the CSP has, anything you can procure from the CSP to help your system is going to be worth doing. And it's up to you to work with the CSP to see what those offerings are and make good use of them. The second one is security through design. So normally to access a Linux server in the public cloud, you need what's called an SSH key pair. Now, good practice perhaps would be to have a different key pair for your different SAP environments. Perhaps you have one for test and prod, one for test, one for dev, a different one for prod. The reason being is if you, I'm going to start this one again. So I've left security until last, but it should be mindful during all phases of an SAP project. As I see it, security for SAP systems in the cloud can be split into 3 different areas. Now, the first one is to use the CSP capability. Now, by that, I mean talking about things like data encryption, network isolation, using monitoring services like CloudTrail to get good visibility of your network and to make sure that you use as much as you can of the CSP's capability to make your systems secure. The second one is security through design. One example is, and certainly on the OS level, if you are using SSH key pairs to connect to your servers, which you often do when they're based in the public cloud, is to have different key pairs for each of your SAP environments. So you have one for test, one for dev, one for pre-prod, and a separate one for production. Same thing for things like virtual networks or VPCs. If you have different ones for your different environments, if in the unlikely occasion that one of them is compromised, there's only going to be one of your environments that gets compromised. You don't have to worry about everything else. But it's the last one, security through process, where SUSE adds the most value. So whilst processes should include things like monitoring and training for staff and so on, one of the key points here is having a good patching regime. Now, I see customers patch everything from once a year through to every 6 months, every quarter, and sometimes the ambitious ones try and patch everything on a monthly basis. But again, having the right tooling in place can help with that. And SUSE has things like live patching and SUSE Manager to help you deliver that level of security via patching. And of course, if all else fails, we did talk a little bit about DR earlier. So we talked a little bit about thinking on how to deploy. All right, we talked about there would be new tooling to do automation. You'd need to invest in people in order to get those right skills in place. But once you know what you're deploying, we talked about the different models of consumption on the public cloud, whether you need to look at pay-as-you-go or bring your own subscription. And again, as our customers go through this exercise, it's up to them to figure out which workloads need to be on which consumption model. Now, of course, you will need HA, and I've kind of pointed you at the best practices for that, so be aware of those and make good use of those. But once the system is out and deployed, think about the day two pieces, about how to do the cost reduction. Now, a lot of that is handled, or a lot of the cost reduction is handled by the CSP in terms of tight sizing and right sizing exercises, but don't forget how SUSE can help with some of those annualized software agreements. And last of all, security needs to be in mind at all times. So if you do have an SAP or a cloud project where you need a little input from SUSE, please get us involved. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and hope you enjoy the rest of SUSECON Digital. Thanks for listening.